Life, it rarely bends the way we command it to. You can plan every detail, draw the perfect picture in your head, and still, something unexpected will always find its way in. A twist of fate, a sudden loss, a moment you didn't see coming. That is the raw truth many of us resist. Life is not how you want, and it never really was. But here's the thing, this isn't a curse. It's a call to wake up, because the suffering begins the moment we try to force reality into the box of our expectations. We say, it should be this way, I deserve that, why isn't life giving me what I imagined? And in that gap between what is and what we think it should be, that's where frustration, anger, and despair live. Imagine standing on a shore trying to stop the tide with your bare hands. The waves don't care about your plans, your demands, or your stubbornness. They rise, they fall, they crash as they always do. And the harder you push against them, the more exhausted you become. Isn't that what most of us are doing with life? Fighting the waves instead of learning how to float. The wisdom of Zen and the clarity of Buddhist teachings cut through this struggle. They remind us, life is not about forcing, but about flowing. It's not about control, but about alignment. When we stop insisting that life must meet our terms, we begin to see what was there all along: opportunity, beauty, and freedom hidden within what actually is. This perspective can sound almost too simple, but think about it. Every disappointment you've ever felt, every ache in your chest, every restless night, wasn't it rooted in the same truth? That life didn't go your way, the job didn't last, the relationship fell apart, the body grew old, the money slipped away. The world refused to match the story you wrote for it. And yet, if we dare to let go of the story, something shifts. Suddenly, we're no longer chained to the fantasy of how life should be. We begin to see the perfection of how life actually is. This is where true strength lies, not in bending reality, but in bending ourselves. Not in demanding the world fit our wants, but in softening our grip and discovering new ways to move with it. Like bamboo in the storm, not breaking but swaying, not resisting but adapting. So let this be our beginning, an invitation to drop the illusion of control, to release the constant tug-of-war with how we want, and to step into the deeper wisdom of what is. Because the moment we stop asking life to obey us, we finally open the door to peace. And from this door, a new journey begins, one where struggle is replaced by clarity, where resistance is softened into acceptance, and where we discover that the very things we thought were obstacles are the stepping stones to freedom. The moment we stop wrestling with life, something extraordinary happens. Our eyes begin to open to its true nature. And here's the revelation: life itself has no agenda. It doesn't love you, it doesn't hate you, it doesn't bend toward your preferences. Life simply is. Think of the sun. It rises every morning not because it wants to bless your day, but because that is its nature. The rain doesn't fall because you prayed for it, nor does it stop because you begged. It falls, and it stops in its own rhythm. A flower blooms not to impress you, but because blooming is what it knows how to do. And yet, we spend our days dividing reality into categories of I like this and I dislike that. When the sun shines on a picnic day, we call it good. When the same sun scorches our skin on a hot afternoon, we call it bad. But tell me, did the sun ever change? Or was it only our perspective that shifted? This is the trap we live in, the constant measuring of life through the narrow lens of desire. We cling desperately to the things we like and push away everything we dislike. But here's the paradox: the harder we cling, the more fragile we become. The harder we resist, the heavier life feels. A Zen master once compared it to walking through a garden. If you only focus on the flowers you love and rage against the weeds you hate, you miss the garden entirely. You miss the harmony, the interdependence, the wild beauty of the whole. To see the nature of life, we must step beyond this endless tug-of-war between like and dislike. We must learn to look at reality without stamping it with our judgment. Not labeling every experience as good or bad, but simply allowing it to be what it is. When we do this, a strange freedom arises. Suddenly, the rain is no longer an enemy, it's just rain. The silence of an empty house is no longer loneliness, it's just silence. Aging is no longer a tragedy, it's simply the unfolding of time. This doesn't mean we become numb or stop caring. It means we stop being ruled by our preferences. We begin to live from a place deeper than desire, deeper than fear. And from that place we find balance. Because when we no longer cling to likes, we no longer panic when they fade. When we no longer fight dislikes, we no longer suffer when they appear. Life still happens, the sun still rises, the rain still falls, but we at last are free. If life is beyond likes and dislikes, then why do we still feel so much pain? Why does sacrifice feel like loss and struggle feel like punishment? The answer is not that life is cruel, it's that growth has always demanded a price. Look closely at nature and you'll see it everywhere. The seed must split open in the dark soil before it can reach the light. The caterpillar must dissolve inside the cocoon before it can take flight. Even the human body grows stronger only when muscles are torn, tested, and rebuilt. We often think pain means something has gone wrong, but what if pain is not the enemy? What if pain is the fire that shapes us, the teacher that strips away illusion, the guide that pushes us beyond the limits of comfort? Sacrifice works the same way. To step into a new chapter of life, something old must be left behind. A habit, a fear, a false identity. And though it feels like loss, it is actually space being made for something greater. Think about it. Every meaningful transformation in your life has carried some measure of discomfort. You sacrificed freedom for responsibility, or comfort for discipline, or security for growth. At the time, it may have felt heavy, even unbearable. But looking back, wasn't it in those very moments that you discovered your strength? The Zen masters remind us, the road of awakening is not smooth. It is carved with tests that burn away what no longer serves us. And yet this burning is not destruction, it is purification. When we resist sacrifice, we cling to old skins that no longer fit. When we run from pain, we abandon the very path that could have carried us to wisdom. But when we embrace them, when we lean into the discomfort, something miraculous happens. The storm doesn't destroy us, it transforms us. So let us see pain not as punishment, but as a passage. Let us see sacrifice not as loss, but as a sacred exchange, giving up what weighs us down to rise into what was always meant to be. Because in the end, growth does not ask whether we are ready. It only asks whether we are willing. Growth doesn't only arrive in grand moments of pain and sacrifice. Often, it begins in the quiet hours when the world is still asleep, and you choose discipline over comfort. The morning is not just another part of the day, it is the foundation upon which everything else rests. Why does discipline matter so much in those early hours? Because the first choices you make each morning set the rhythm for your entire life. If you rise with intention, your day carries clarity. If you rise with laziness, your day drifts in chaos. The discipline of the morning is nothing less than the discipline of the soul. Think of a monk in training. He does not wake at dawn because it is easy, but because it forges strength. Each breath of cold morning air is a reminder, I am stronger than my excuses. Each moment of meditation at sunrise whispers, I am the master of my mind, not its servant. This is the secret. Discipline is not about punishing yourself. It's about aligning with your highest self. When you resist the urge to sleep in, when you choose silence instead of distraction, when you greet the day with awareness instead of resistance, you unlock an inner power that no one can take away. And this power doesn't stay in the morning. It flows into every part of your life. The discipline that keeps you steady at dawn is the same discipline that helps you stay calm in chaos. The same discipline that allows you to keep promises. The same discipline that carries you through storms without breaking. Most people wait for motivation to arrive as if it will descend like a blessing. But Zen teaches us that waiting is weakness. Discipline is not waiting, it is choosing. It is the act of rising even when your body protests, focusing even when your mind wanders, showing up even when comfort tempts you to stay behind. And here lies the paradox. The more you practice discipline, the freer you become. Because when you no longer bow to laziness, you are free. When you no longer depend on fleeting moods, you are free. When your actions come from intention, not impulse, you discover a strength that feels unshakable. So when the sun rises tomorrow, remember, morning is not just a beginning. It is a battlefield where you decide who will lead your life, your excuses or your higher self. And every day you choose discipline, you choose freedom. Discipline builds our inner strength, but where do we test it? Not only in the quiet mornings, but in the unpredictable classroom of life itself. Every encounter, every setback, every joy and every loss, this is the real training ground. Life does not hand us a syllabus, yet it teaches with a precision no school could match. Think about it. When has life taught you the most? Was it when everything was easy, predictable, comfortable? Or was it when something unexpected shook your world? A betrayal that revealed the meaning of trust? A failure that showed the weight of persistence? A heartbreak that carved the depth of compassion? Life is not interested in whether you like its lessons. It only asks that you learn them. And if you don't, the lesson repeats again and again until you see what was always hidden inside it. A Zen saying goes, "The obstacle is the path." How true this is. The very thing we try to avoid often carries the wisdom we need. The job you lost forces you to discover your real purpose. The rejection you feared frees you to walk a truer road. Even illness, unwelcome and painful, can open your eyes to the value of each breath. When you begin to see life as a teacher, something shifts inside. You no longer ask, "Why me?" Instead, you ask, "What is this moment showing me?" That simple change transforms suffering into understanding, confusion into clarity, and despair into growth. But here's the catch: life doesn't lecture in words. It whispers in experiences. You must be still enough, open enough, humble enough to listen. A monk once said, "The world is always speaking, but most people are too busy shouting their demands to hear it." To learn, you must first quiet the noise. So let us see every moment not as random, not as punishment, but as guidance. When life is gentle, be grateful. When life is harsh, be attentive. Both are teachers, both are mirrors, both are gifts. Because in truth, every single day is a lesson. Every sunrise is a reminder. Every hardship is a doorway. And the more we open ourselves to this great teacher, the more life itself transforms into wisdom. Before you can walk any path, you must first know where you stand. That is why acceptance is the beginning of all transformation. Without it, no growth is possible. But acceptance is not resignation. It is not giving up or saying, "This is how it is and I can never change it." No. True acceptance is the courage to look at your life exactly as it is, without denial, without excuses, without the need to blame others or hide behind illusions. We all carry regrets, choices we wish we could take back, words we wish we hadn't spoken, dreams we let slip away. But unless you accept those mistakes and their consequences, you remain chained to the past. You keep replaying the same story, hoping for a different ending, and that, my friend, is suffering. A Zen master once told his students, "If you fall, don't curse the ground. Instead, thank it for teaching you where you were not careful." Acceptance is exactly that. It is bowing to reality, even when reality hurts, so you can rise with clarity. Think of a river. If you fight its current, you exhaust yourself. You waste your strength in resistance. But the moment you accept the current, you can finally learn to swim with it, to use its force to move forward. Life works the same way. When you say, "Yes, this is where I am. Yes, these are the mistakes I've made. Yes, this is the pain I carry," something amazing happens. You release the weight of denial. Tears may come, anger may rise, grief may surface. But that is healing, not weakness. That is the body and mind letting go of years of resistance. Acceptance does not mean you approve of injustice or welcome pain. It means you see reality clearly, and from that clarity you find your first solid step. Only when you stand firmly in the present can you begin to shape the future. Because if you refuse to accept, you remain stuck in illusion. You keep saying, "Life should be this way, I should be that way, they should treat me differently." And every should becomes a chain around your heart. But when you finally whisper, "Yes, this is how it is and I will begin here," those chains fall away. Acceptance is the first step, not the final one, but the first. Without it, there is no journey. With it, every path opens. Once you accept where you stand, the next question arises. Where do I go from here? And here lies one of the greatest misunderstandings of life. We believe we must know the outcome before we even begin. We demand certainty. We demand guarantees, but life does not work this way. Think of it, no seed knows exactly how tall it will grow, how many branches it will bear, or how far its roots will spread. It only knows to grow toward the light. The direction is clear, even if the final form is a mystery. Too many of us get trapped in rigid goals. I must earn this much money by this age. I must marry this type of person. I must live in this kind of house. And when life, in its unpredictable wisdom, does not deliver that exact outcome, we feel cheated, broken, even worthless. But what if the real wisdom is not in fixing outcomes, but in shaping direction? What if the point is not to dictate the destination, but to walk the path with clarity, openness, and trust? Imagine you are walking through a forest. If you focus only on reaching a particular tree, you will miss the bird song, the fresh air, the wildflowers that line the trail. You might even become frustrated when the trail bends another way. But if your direction is simply eastward, you remain free. Whatever tree you meet, whatever clearing you discover, becomes part of the journey. This is how life flows. You cannot predict every encounter, every twist, every storm. But you can choose a direction. Toward compassion instead of bitterness, toward courage instead of fear, toward connection instead of isolation. That direction shapes your character more than any fixed outcome ever could. A Buddhist teaching says, we don't control the waves, but we can learn to surf. The waves are life, unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent. The surfboard is your direction, how you choose to ride what comes. If you try to control the ocean, you drown. But if you align your direction with its flow, you discover freedom. So let us release the obsession with outcomes. Let us not measure life only by trophies, titles, or timelines. Instead, let us ask, am I moving in the direction of love, of wisdom, of peace? If so, then every step, even the difficult ones, carries meaning. Remember, life will surprise you. The final form of your journey may be very different from what you imagined. But if your direction is true, you will look back and see not disappointment, but beauty. Because the real destination was never a place. It was the person you became while walking the path. If direction matters more than fixed outcomes, then what is the truest direction? It is the path of love, compassion, and connection. Because at the end of all striving, at the end of all ambition, what we crave most is not power or possessions. It is the warmth of belonging, the comfort of being understood, the profound joy of knowing we are not alone. Love is not just romance, not just passion that flickers and fades. Love, in its deepest form, is expansion. It radiates from the center of your being like ripples on a still pond, touching everything around you. It is not limited to family or friends. True love expands outward, toward strangers, toward nature, even toward those who have wronged us. Compassion is love in action. It is the choice to see suffering and respond, not with judgment but with care. To hold another's pain as if it were your own. To understand that behind every harsh word, every cold glance, lies a human being carrying invisible burdens. Compassion does not excuse harm, but it heals the cycle of harm by refusing to return it. And connection, this is the fruit of love and compassion. When you open your heart, the walls you once built between yourself and the world begin to dissolve. You feel the web that links you to all things. You sense that your joy rises when others are uplifted, and your sorrow deepens when others fall. Suddenly, life is no longer a solitary struggle but a shared journey. Think of the last time you truly felt connected. Maybe it was a moment of shared laughter with a friend. Maybe it was sitting quietly under a vast sky, realizing you are part of something immeasurably greater. Maybe it was holding the hand of someone in pain when no words were needed, only presence. These moments are glimpses of the truth, that separation is an illusion and connection is our natural state. Buddhism teaches that the ultimate truth of the universe is love. Not sentimental, not fragile, but boundless, unshakable, expansive love. a love that embraces even those we cannot see, a love that extends beyond this earth, beyond time, beyond self. When we live from this space of love and compassion, we discover strength we never knew we had. Forgiveness becomes possible, kindness becomes natural, and life, no matter how difficult, feels meaningful. The world does not need more walls, more fear, more division. What it needs is people willing to live with open hearts, people who dare to connect, even when it's easier to turn away, people who understand that every act of compassion ripples outward in ways unseen, shaping a world that is softer, kinder, more alive. So let us walk in this direction, not chasing outcomes, not clinging to illusions, but opening ourselves, again and again, to love, to compassion, to connection. For in the end, that is not only the greatest gift we give others, it is the greatest gift we give ourselves. Forgiveness is not about excusing the wrongs of others, nor is it about denying the pain we have endured. Forgiveness is the decision to no longer let the weight of resentment, anger, or betrayal shape the course of our inner life. It is not about what the other person deserves. It is about what we deserve: freedom, peace, and the chance to live unchained from the past. When we hold on to anger, it becomes a poison that we sip every day, expecting the other person to suffer. Yet the only one weakened is ourselves. Forgiveness is not a gift we give to someone else. It is the greatest gift we give to our own heart. By releasing the grip of old wounds, we reclaim our energy, our clarity, and our joy. Buddhism teaches that clinging, whether to pleasure, pain, love, or hate, creates suffering. Anger is one of the most destructive forms of clinging, burning not only the one it is aimed at but also the vessel that carries it. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means transforming the pain into wisdom, seeing that everything, even harm, can be a teacher. Forgiveness is strength, not weakness. It requires the courage to face the depth of our hurt without being consumed by it. It demands that we rise above the instinct of revenge and instead choose compassion, not because the other deserves it, but because we deserve peace. Letting go, too, is an act of liberation. To let go is to release the illusion of control over how others should act, how life should unfold, or how justice should be delivered. It is stepping into the flow of life without dragging behind the anchors of yesterday. Imagine a bird trying to fly with heavy stones tied to its wings. It cannot rise, no matter how strong its desire. Forgiveness and letting go are the cutting of those ropes. Many people resist forgiveness because they believe it means condoning what was done. But true forgiveness is not about erasing accountability. It is about refusing to let the wound dictate your future. You can forgive and still choose boundaries. You can forgive and still walk away. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. It is inner healing. Think of water flowing around rocks in a river. It does not resist. It does not hold on. It simply finds a way to continue forward. This is the spirit of letting go. The rocks may remain, but the water is never trapped. The Buddha once said, "Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned." When we let go, the coal falls from our hand. Our palm may still bear the mark, but it can heal in the sunlight of compassion. In life, betrayal, rejection, and loss are inevitable. But whether these experiences harden us or soften us is a choice. Forgiveness softens the heart, keeping it alive, tender, and open to love again. Without forgiveness, bitterness calcifies around the soul, closing it off from connection and joy. Forgiveness and letting go do not happen in an instant. They are processes, journeys of peeling back the layers of pain until what remains is clarity. Sometimes we must forgive not only others but ourselves, for mistakes, regrets, or choices made in ignorance. Self-forgiveness is perhaps the hardest, but without it, we remain trapped in shame. To forgive is to let the past be the past, to step forward unburdened. To let go is to trust that life is wiser than our judgments, that time heals what the mind cannot, and that freedom is worth more than being right. In the silence of meditation, imagine your heart releasing all the burdens it carries. Imagine old anger dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Imagine forgiving not for them, but for you. Because you deserve peace, because you deserve to fly. Life is not measured by the years we accumulate, but by the depth with which we live each moment. To live fully is not to chase endless pleasures, achievements, or recognition. It is to be present, awake, and at peace with the unfolding of existence. Every lesson we have explored, discipline, acceptance, compassion, forgiveness, letting go, points to the same truth. Fulfillment is an inner state, not an outer acquisition. The richest person is not the one who owns the most, but the one who needs the least. The strongest person is not the one who conquers others, but the one who conquers the storms within. To live fully is to embrace impermanence. Knowing that everything changes allows us to love more deeply, forgive more easily, and worry less about things that do not last. Impermanence does not diminish life. It gives life its beauty. A flower is precious not despite its short bloom, but because of it. Living fully also means cultivating awareness. When we eat, we taste. When we walk, we feel the earth beneath our feet. When we listen, we hear not just words, but the heart behind them. Life reveals its treasures in the simplest of acts when we are truly present. Connection is another pillar of a full life. We are not separate islands. We are waves of the same ocean. Love, kindness, and compassion are not luxuries. They are the fabric of our existence. Each time we offer a smile, a gentle word, or a hand to someone in need, we expand the circle of life's fullness. To live fully also requires courage. The courage to step into the unknown, to face pain without retreat, to let go when it is time, and to forgive even when the wound runs deep. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something greater, peace, freedom, compassion, is worth more than fear. In the end, life is the greatest teacher. It whispers wisdom in joy and shouts lessons through suffering. Every sunrise is a chance to begin again. Every breath is a reminder that we are alive here now. To live fully is to learn continuously, to grow endlessly, and to walk lightly on the earth, leaving behind not scars but seeds of love. The Buddha's path does not ask us to escape life, but to engage it with clarity, with compassion, and with courage. The practice is not in temples or rituals alone. It is in the way we rise each morning, the way we treat others, and the way we return each night to silence and gratitude. So as we close this journey, remember, life will never be perfect, but it can always be whole. Do not wait for tomorrow to live, for tomorrow is never promised. Live today, fully, mindfully, compassionately. That is the greatest offering we can make to ourselves and to the world. If you felt something stir within while listening, let this be the beginning of a deeper journey. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and join a community devoted to living with clarity, kindness, and freedom. Until we meet again, may peace be with you.